Andy Patton of Locked On Zags. Adding basketball-only schools to the Big 12, whether it's Mark Few's squad or a UConn, I think it's never going to happen. Qualify, defend, truth, fallacy. What say you?
Well, I think whenever this argument gets brought up, the first thing people mention is, well, they're not going to generate as much money as the football schools. And it's like, yeah, duh, yes. Like, I think that is a very obvious point that doesn't need to be hammered home, because you're not offering a Gonzaga or a UConn or a program like that as much money. They're not going to take money from the football schools and not produce any money because they don't have football. That's not what's going to happen. Yep. The conversations that have happened between the Big 12 and Gonzaga, from what we have heard, there have been many conversations. Brett Yormark, basically every time the Big 12 says, hey, no, not right now, he says, okay, fine. And then 3 weeks later, he's like, what about now? What about now? What about now? It feels like that's kind of been the trend that we have seen. And Gonzaga has done a ton of research on their end to try to prove their worth. But ultimately, I think the start of the conversation is that this is not an addition that the Big 12 would make that would cost the schools as much money, the conference as much money. It would be a smaller addition because they're not playing football. And I know that sounds obvious, but I think people hear it and they think, well, they're not going to generate the same money that even a bad football program would be. So why would we add them if we're paying them the same amount? You're not paying them the same amount. You're paying them a smaller amount. And to reference the value of Gonzaga basketball from a TV perspective, like, it is huge. Like, it's really important to acknowledge how massive it is. Gonzaga's TV power over the last 10 years is fifth among all college basketball programs. The 4 programs in front of them: Duke, North Carolina, Kansas, Kentucky.
Decent.
That's a pretty good group of college basketball teams right there. Gonzaga is consistently one of the most watched college basketball programs in the country during the regular season, during the non-conference season, during the NCAA tournament. They're turning out more NBA players than every single team in the Big 12 except for Kansas. They are a dominant college basketball program. They are not just dominating in their conference. And I don't think anybody at this point, Gonzaga has kind of ascended past the point where people doubt their ability to win big games. They've been to 9 straight Sweet 16s. If anybody's still doubting that, I don't know what to tell them. They curb stomped Kansas in the NCAA tournament last year. Like, this is a team that has clearly proven they deserve to be where they're at and would clearly compete in the Big 12. I'm not saying they'd come in and win. I think they'd barely be a top 5 team this year, but that's a testament to the fact that Kansas, Houston, Baylor, Iowa State, and Arizona is an incredibly good group of teams. But they're generating a TV number that would rival every single team in the Big 12. And if you're looking at, if the schools are serious about adding value to your conference, paying a school like Gonzaga significantly less money to come into your conference to generate as much TV power as every team in your conference, like all of them right at the top, you're going to be getting the same numbers as Kansas and Baylor and Houston and all of those teams, if not more.
Yep.
If not more. If I'm the Big 12 and you can add a team that's probably going to get more eyeballs on your basketball than any other team you could conceivably add, and you're asking the schools to pay a third of what you're asking them to pay to add a team like Washington State or Oregon State, who aren't going to do anything during the basketball season. I mean, even if Washington State's good, like, they're not going to finish in the top 10 in the Big 12 90% of the time, and they're not going to generate any interest from a TV viewing perspective. Obviously, the football is significantly more, but you're paying 2 times as much for Washington State than you would for Gonzaga. You have to at least have that conversation. And I think you're probably right that the Big 12 it would take a lot for them to do this, but Gonzaga is desperate. They don't want to be left holding the bag. If/when the SEC and the Big 10 decide, hey, we're just not going to let mid-majors in the NCAA tournament anymore. Like, everybody thinks about, that affects the plucky schools like the Florida Gulf Coast or whatever. That affects a lot of programs, and it could affect Gonzaga. And it would kill Gonzaga. It would crush them if they weren't able to play in the NCAA tournament. They have to find a way to prevent that from happening, and getting into the Big 12 is a way to do that. And if you're looking at a desperate school that is willing to take a small amount of money and is going to generate more TV power than almost every school in your conference in the second most important sport, there's a very compelling argument there.
If the Pac-12 holds on for one more year, Gonzaga very well could be a Big 12 school. We know that Brett McMurphy and Ross Dellinger have had reports that Brett Yormark's been in the back pocket of Mark Few and company in Spokane for a while now, talking about whether or not that school can become a Big 12 entity. And UConn is even in that batch over the last decade. Andy, the pushback would be, I'm very interested to see how you, again, this is a tough question. It's a hypothetical, but it is what Brett Yormark asks is, hey, if Mark Few retires tomorrow, or if Gonzaga goes 3 years of bad basketball, that is a big if, a big hypothetical, but then where is the value? How do you defend a question like that?
It's a reasonable question. I would point out that Gonzaga hasn't had 3 bad years in a row in 25 years.
25 years, yeah.
I think I think that's a compelling point. And people will point to like, okay, they made the tournament 25 years in a row. But and I think there's this sentiment that, a lot of that time they only made it because they were just barely better than the rest of the teams in WCC. That's not really true. In the last 10 years, they would have made the tournament in almost any conference. Pretty much every one of those years. There's been a few years where it was like, it was a little bit questionable. But most of the time they would have made the NCAA tournament. Having said that, yes, the Mark Few concern is valid. And I wish that, again, if we're talking a couple years ago when Tommy Lloyd had not taken the job at Arizona, that might change the conversation because everybody knew, okay, Tommy's next in line. When Mark Few retires, Tommy Lloyd's going to take over. And, that was the chatter around Gonzaga's sphere. And people outside of that were like, but is some assistant coach going to be able to take over that program and immediately lead them to success? Yes, he would have been. I mean, clearly, we look at what happened at Arizona. Yes, they haven't had sustained NCAA tournament success, but Tommy Lloyd's ability to recruit and to coach and get wins for that team have been tremendous. Now, Gonzaga doesn't necessarily have that guy on staff anymore. Brian Michelson has been there for 10 years. He played in the program 20 years ago. He's been around for a long time. Maybe he can step up and be that guy, but he doesn't have the same pedigree and the same kind of perception that somebody like Tommy Lloyd did. I think if Gonzaga does lose Mark Few, they maybe look at Leon Rice at Boise State, who was a coach at Gonzaga for 10 years. Leon Rice is a good coach who has never won an NCAA tournament game.
Yeah.
Like that, I mean, that's a much bigger risk. Mark Few seems like he's going to coach until the day that he dies, and that may be a long time from now. But it is fair to have that be a concern. But again, I would go back to the point of you're not pouring as much money into Gonzaga as you are as other programs. So yes, if Gonzaga takes a dip, if Gonzaga loses their coach, first of all, if Mark Few retires when they're already in the Big 12, they have a better chance of landing a good coach, which they wouldn't be able to do if they were in the WCC. So I think that they would still be able, the brand would be so successful. The alumni base is not huge, but they're funneling money into the program right now. You can tell by the transfer portal additions they're getting that they have the NIL funds to survive in this era. That would only increase in the Big 12. And I think that if they're in the Big 12 for 5 years before Mark Few retires, the program is in a solid enough spot that I don't think that you would see that dip or that fear or that concern. But I understand why it is a valid point to bring up right now while they're still not in the conference.
The reason I put Gonzaga and Connecticut together is because Connecticut just doesn't have football. I mean, if we're really transparent here, both schools play about the same brand of football. And UConn is 50th in the nation in revenue numbers, right behind Kansas State, who's 49th. And that's playing in the Big East in basketball and playing, in essence, without a football team. When you have a basketball program of the two profitable sports in the country that is that profitable, and Gonzaga's right there with you, there is value in adding them to the Big 12. And I do think, again, as we become a Pangea hodgepodge of, I'll take you and you and you, and let's just try to make more TV money, those schools are going to be on the table for a conference like the Big 12. Andy, Pat, before we get out of here, if folks want to find more of your content on Locked On College Basketball or Locked On Zags, where do they go? What do you got going on?
Yeah, wherever you find Locked On Big 12, you can find Locked On College Basketball. We're 5 days a week. It's myself, my co-host, Isaac Shade. It's one of us hosting every single show. We're talking transfer portal stuff right now. We're starting to get into some NBA draft profiles as well. Again, it's every single day. Even if the season is long over, we're still talking over there. Locked On Zags, same stuff every single day, talking about conference realignment, talking about the transfer portal, whatnot. I also do some writing about college basketball for USA Today's College Sports Wire, so you can find that there as well. So it's a lot of college basketball content. So if you're into hoops, definitely come check it out.
Which it's the Big 12. Of course we're into hoops, Andy. This is our backyard. And on my Spotify, which is where I go to listen to Locked On Anything, it says under Big 12, hosts' favorite shows, Locked On College Basketball, because it's my second listen every day right after Locked On Big 12. Speaking of, come back on Monday. We'll give you even more content on the transfer portal right now. Expansion, as it's an ever-changing world across the college landscape, and the ACC is being sued by 3 people, which is not good for them. This has been and always will be Locked On. Thanks for making it your first listen every single day. Dose Grande.